My parents stole my inheritance and lied for years. You won't believe how I exposed them at my brother's baby shower, and then I never imagined I would be standing on my parents' front porch, feeling like an intruder in the house where I grew up. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue, and I could hear the soft hum of laughter and clinking glasses coming from the backyard. I stood there clutching a carefully wrapped present, my heart pounding in my chest as my 15-year-old daughter Maya gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. This was supposed to be a happy moment, a chance to celebrate my younger brother Eli's soon-to-be-born baby, but instead, I felt like I was about to walk into a storm I didn't even know was coming. Maya had convinced me that we should at least try to drop off the gift to show that we cared, even though we hadn't been invited. I had spent the entire morning debating with myself, torn between swallowing my pride and avoiding the humiliation I feared awaited us. My parents, Diane and Mark, had always made it clear where I stood in the family pecking order, but this felt different. This felt intentional. I rang the doorbell, my stomach twisting in knots, and tried to steady my breathing as we waited. The door opened, and my mother's face lit up with her usual hostess smile, but the moment she registered who was standing on her doorstep, her expression darkened. It was as if a shadow passed over her features, and in that instant, I felt like I had crashed a party where I didn't belong. "Sarah, Maya, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with annoyance more than surprise. Before I could answer, Maya stepped forward with a calmness that both startled and impressed me. She lifted the gift slightly and smiled sweetly, as if daring my mother to reject this gesture of goodwill. "We just came to drop off a present for Eli and Claire's baby," Maya said, her voice steady and warm. My mother's eyes flicked from the gift to my daughter's face and back again, and for a moment I thought she might soften. Instead, she shook her head slightly and said in a low, firm voice, "This isn't the right time, Sarah. You shouldn't have come. This is a private family gathering, and you weren't invited for a reason." The words hit me harder than I expected, sharper than any of the countless small slights I had endured over the years. My throat tightened, and I fought the urge to turn and walk away. I could see figures behind her now, relatives peering through windows, curious about the unexpected visitors who had interrupted the celebration. My father appeared at the door then, his face registering discomfort as he took in the scene. "What's going on, Diane?" he asked, his eyes shifting uneasily from me to Maya and back again. Before my mother could answer, Maya spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We know we don't belong here, Grandma. That's why Dad's lawyer came with us today." The words hung in the air, and for a second the world seemed to stop turning. I heard the laughter from the backyard fade into silence as the weight of Maya's statement sank in. From down the street, a man in a crisp suit stepped onto the sidewalk and approached our porch with measured, confident strides. He carried a leather briefcase, and his expression was unreadable as he climbed the steps to stand beside us. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Tom. I represent Brandon in matters concerning his daughter Maya and her mother, Sarah." My parents' faces drained of color, their composure slipping as confusion and panic flickered across their features. I was as stunned as they were. I turned to Maya, questions spilling into my mind, but she met my gaze with a silent plea for trust. "We should probably take this conversation inside," Tom continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Unless, of course, you prefer to conduct it in front of the entire neighborhood." My father stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He gestured for us to come in, and we crossed the threshold into a house that no longer felt like home. Inside, the decorations mocked me with their cheerful blue and white streamers, the cake that read, "Welcome Baby," sitting untouched on the table. Surrounded by neatly stacked presents, the guests had fallen silent, their conversations replaced by hushed whispers as they watched the unfolding scene with wide eyes. Eli appeared at the edge of the room, his arm around Claire's waist as she shifted uncomfortably, clearly confused by the sudden shift in mood. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, his voice uncertain as he tried to piece together what was happening. I shook my head, still trying to make sense of it myself, still reeling from Maya's revelation in the presence of the lawyer standing beside me. Tom set his briefcase on the coffee table, opened it with a practiced motion, and drew out a folder thick with documents. "We'll keep this brief," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, making sure everyone heard him clearly. "For many years, Brandon has fulfilled his legal obligation to support his daughter Maya. Payments were sent as requested to Mark and Diane, who assured him they would see that the funds were used for Maya's care and well-being. The words hit like a hammer, each syllable driving home the truth I hadn't known I needed to hear. A low murmur rippled through the room as the reality of what Tom was saying began to sink in. I felt my knees go weak, the betrayal almost too much to bear. My parents stood frozen, unable to deny what was being laid bare before friends and family. The perfect image they had crafted over the years was unraveling, and there was no way to stop it now. For a few moments, the room was eerily silent as everyone processed the lawyer's words. I felt my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears, and I tried to steady my breath. The reality of what had been hidden from me for so long now stood exposed in front of people who had once thought of my parents as generous, honorable, and devoted. My mother's mouth opened as if she were about to defend herself, but no words came out. My father clenched his fists at his sides, his face turning a deep shade of red as though anger could somehow erase what had just been revealed. Tom remained composed, laying out document after document on the coffee table in front of us. He spoke with that calm, unshakable tone that made the truth feel even heavier. He explained how, for nearly 13 years, Brandon had sent payments faithfully, trusting my parents' promises that the funds would reach me and help provide for Maya. As Tom spoke, I watched my parents shift uncomfortably, their shame growing clearer with every sentence. He detailed how the money had instead been redirected, spent on Eli's college tuition, house renovations, vacations my parents had taken, and even the down payment for Eli's first car. I stood there, too stunned to speak, as the full extent of the betrayal unfolded before me. My mind raced back through the years, recalling all those sleepless nights when I had worried about paying rent, about keeping the heat on in the winter, about affording decent shoes for Maya. All that time, the support I needed had been there, hidden by the very people who claimed they loved us. Maya gripped my hand tightly, and in that moment, I drew strength from her. She had known enough of the truth to set this in motion, and I realized she had done it not out of spite, but out of love and a desire to protect what was rightfully ours. Eli finally broke the silence, his voice strained with disbelief and confusion. He asked our parents if what the lawyer said was true, his eyes darting between them and me, as if hoping someone would deny it and restore order to the chaos that had consumed the room. My father muttered something about difficult times, about how they had intended to repay it all eventually, but his excuses rang hollow and weak. My mother finally found her voice, trying to spin the story, claiming they had only borrowed the money temporarily to help with unexpected expenses. She insisted they had always planned to set things right once they were financially stable. Tom didn't let them hide behind their words for long. He laid out the two options Brandon was offering. Either they repay the full sum, including interest, within 60 days, or Brandon would pursue both civil and criminal charges. My parents' faces went pale, and I could see their world crumbling as they realized they were out of options. Eli's wife, Claire, stood awkwardly off to the side, clutching her swollen belly, looking as if she wanted to disappear. I felt a flicker of sympathy for her, caught in the middle of something she clearly hadn't known about, but it passed quickly. The damage was too deep, too raw. Guests began to quietly leave, unable or unwilling to witness any more of the drama. Some offered awkward nods or murmured apologies as they slipped out the door. Others simply avoided my gaze, as if doing so could erase their discomfort at having seen my family's secrets laid bare. The house, once filled with celebration, now echoed with the weight of betrayal and shame. My father's voice rose in frustration as he tried to argue that families should settle matters privately, without dragging outsiders into it. But no one was listening anymore. The truth had spoken louder than any justification ever could. Eli looked at me with a mixture of guilt and regret, finally understanding the reality I had lived for so many years. He admitted he had known some money had come from Brandon, but claimed he had believed it was a small amount to cover past debts, not the large sum that had actually changed hands. His words felt like another cut, a reminder of how easy it had been for him to benefit from what had been stolen from Maya and me without questioning it. He apologized, but the words felt empty, too little and far too late. I wanted to say something, to express the anger, the sorrow, the deep betrayal that burned inside me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I simply turned to Maya and nodded, signaling that it was time for us to leave. Tom gathered his documents and followed us out, leaving my parents to face the shattered remains of their perfect image. As we stepped onto the porch, the late afternoon sun seemed blinding after the storm inside. I felt hollow but oddly relieved. The truth was finally out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The drive home from my parents' house was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. Maya sat beside me, staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts while I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my mind struggling to catch up with everything that had just unfolded. My stomach churned with a mix of relief and sorrow, knowing that the truth had finally come out, but also knowing that what had been broken couldn't simply be put back together. The betrayal had roots that went deeper than I had ever imagined, and now there was no hiding from it anymore. When we pulled into the driveway of our small house, I shut off the engine and let out a shaky breath, trying to gather myself before going inside. Maya turned to me then, her eyes filled with worry and something else, strength. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said softly, and I could see how much she meant it. I shook my head and reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I told her, meaning every word. "You did what I should have done a long time ago. You stood up for us when I was too afraid to." That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, memories came flooding back. The nights I stayed up late working extra shifts, the mornings I cried quietly in the shower because I didn't know how I would pay the bills, the birthdays when I could only afford small gifts for Maya, while my parents showered Eli with expensive presents and trips. All that time, the support I needed had been stolen by the very people who were supposed to have my back. It was like reliving every sacrifice, every heartbreak, with the added sting of knowing how unnecessary so much of it had been. Over the next few days, the aftermath of that afternoon played out in ways I hadn't fully expected. My phone rang constantly at first, with relatives calling to express shock, sympathy, or, in some cases, to distance themselves from the mess. Some of my cousins admitted they had always seen how differently I was treated, but they'd told themselves it wasn't their place to speak up. A few aunts and uncles apologized for not intervening sooner, their voices heavy with regret. I listened, thanked them for their concern, but I felt detached from it all, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Mark and Diane tried calling too, leaving voicemails that swung between tearful apologies and defensive justifications. They insisted they had always meant to pay the money back, that they'd only borrowed it during hard times, that they had done it out of love and a desire to protect me from Brandon's influence. I deleted the messages without responding. I wasn't ready to hear more lies or empty excuses. I needed time, space, and clarity before I could even think about what came next. Then, about a week after the confrontation, Eli reached out. He asked if we could meet for coffee, said he needed to talk, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes, and when I walked in, I barely recognized my brother. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with guilt and exhaustion. He stood as I approached, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, and I could see how deeply he was struggling with everything that had happened. We sat down, and for the first time in years, we talked honestly. He confessed that he had known Brandon was sending money, but he had never questioned where it was really supposed to go. He had accepted it because it made his life easier, and because questioning it would have meant facing uncomfortable truths he wasn't ready to face. I listened, my heart aching, as he described how he had always felt like he was living in my shadow, how he'd accepted our parents' favoritism because it made him feel less inadequate. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me understand the twisted dynamics that had shaped our family for so long. "I want to make this right, Sarah," he said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "Whatever Mom and Dad can't repay, Claire and I will cover. It's the least I can do, after everything." His offer surprised me, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I told him it wasn't his responsibility, that he didn't owe me anything, but he shook his head firmly. "Maybe not legally," he said, "but morally, I do. I benefited from their choices, and I can't just look the other way anymore." I saw sincerity in his eyes, and though the wounds were still raw, I felt the first flicker of hope that perhaps, in time, We could rebuild something out of the wreckage. Meanwhile, Brandon had begun quietly stepping into Maya's life, showing up to her debate competitions, taking her out for lunch on weekends, helping her research colleges. He never tried to overcompensate with gifts or grand gestures. Instead, he showed up with consistency, with presence, and with respect for the boundaries Maya set. I kept my distance emotionally, still too wary to trust him fully after all the years he had been absent, but I couldn't deny that he seemed determined to do things right this time. His wife, Laura, and their two young sons welcomed Maya without hesitation, and I saw how she blossomed under the warmth of this unexpected new connection. As for my parents, they began making payments through Tom, just as they had agreed, selling off assets and dipping into retirement funds to cover the debt they could no longer deny. The money arrived each month without fail, but without any personal note or communication. It felt transactional, empty of the love they claimed had motivated their choices. I kept my distance, not out of anger, but because I needed time to heal, to process, and to figure out what, if anything, I wanted my relationship with them to look like going forward. Through it all, Maya remained my rock, wise beyond her years and steady in her belief that we deserved better. Watching her navigate this storm with such grace and strength made me prouder than I could put into words. We had been through so much, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were standing on solid ground, ready to build a future on our own terms. Months passed, and slowly the dust began to settle, though the scars remained visible in ways I hadn't fully expected. The payments from my parents arrived on time, as promised, but each check felt like another reminder of what had been stolen from Maya and me for so many years. There were no handwritten notes, no efforts at genuine apology beyond what their lawyer had insisted upon. Each envelope that arrived was cold, formal, and devoid of the love they so often claimed guided their decisions. I found myself feeling strangely hollow as I deposited those checks, knowing they could never truly repay what had been taken from us. Eli and Claire stayed true to their word, quietly setting aside money to help cover whatever our parents might fall short on. They visited often, bringing their newborn son, who was a sweet, bright-eyed baby named Oliver. I hadn't expected to feel anything but bitterness toward that child, but when I held him in my arms for the first time, all I saw was an innocent life untouched by the choices of the adults around him. Maya adored her little cousin, and I encouraged the bond, believing that no child should bear the weight of his family's mistakes. Slowly, my relationship with Eli began to heal, not perfectly and not without effort, but in a way that felt genuine. Brandon continued to be part of Maya's life, and I had to admit, despite my lingering reservations, that he had changed. He never overstepped, never tried to insert himself where he wasn't wanted, and always deferred to Maya's wishes about how and when they spent time together. His sons looked up to her as if she had always been there, and Laura welcomed her with a kindness that felt natural rather than forced. I remained polite but distant toward Brandon, still unsure if I could ever forgive him fully, but I respected the way he handled this second chance, without arrogance or expectation. One spring afternoon, as I was organizing a closet that had been ignored for years, I found an old box tucked behind some winter blankets. Inside were photographs, letters, and a few of Maya's early school drawings that I had thought were lost. I sat down on the floor, sifting through the memories, and the weight of everything hit me anew. All those moments I had cherished, all those struggles I had endured, could have been eased if only my parents had made different choices. The anger bubbled up again, but alongside it came a strange sense of peace. We had survived without their help, and we had built a life worth being proud of. Nathan from the law firm kept in regular contact, updating us on the repayments and making sure all agreements were honored. He was professional, kind, and never made me feel like I was asking for more than what we were due. It was through him that I learned my parents had begun attending family therapy on their own, perhaps realizing that what they had broken wouldn't fix itself. I didn't allow myself to hope too much, knowing that real change would take more than a few counseling sessions and signed checks. Maya, ever practical, reminded me that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting, and that trust, once shattered, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. By summer, Maya had made her decision about college, choosing to attend a university in Philadelphia, close enough for weekend visits but far enough to carve out her independence. The money my parents had hoarded, now being returned with interest, would cover most of her tuition. It felt like a strange kind of justice, though I wished with all my heart she had never been denied the security it could have provided while she was growing up. We planned a small but joyful celebration for her, inviting friends, colleagues, and the people who had stood by us through the storm. There were no calls from my parents asking to attend, and I felt relief rather than sorrow at their absence. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink behind the trees, a delivery van pulled up unexpectedly. The driver handed me a small package addressed in careful handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a plain envelope containing only a thin stack of documents and a short note that made my blood run cold. The note read simply, "You deserve to know everything, a friend." I unfolded the papers, my hands trembling slightly, and as I read through the contents, my heart sank deeper with each line. It appeared that, beyond the stolen child support, my mother had hidden another secret, a trust fund set up by my grandfather when I was born, meant for me to access at age 21. That fund had been emptied years ago, its contents funneled quietly into a hidden account that only Diane controlled. The money had been substantial, more than enough to have changed the course of my early adult life and Maya's childhood. I sat there in stunned silence, realizing that the betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined, that even now, after everything, more layers of deceit continued to surface. The documents detailed withdrawals, transfers, and investments that benefited no one but my mother, including plans to purchase a vacation property abroad in a retirement community I had never heard her mention. I called Nathan the next morning, forwarding him the documents, and within hours, he confirmed their authenticity. My parents hadn't just stolen what Brandon had sent. They had siphoned away a legacy my grandfather had wanted me to have, all while I had scraped and fought for every small victory in my life. I felt a weariness settle into my bones, but also a renewed determination. I would not let this final betrayal pass unanswered, no matter how exhausted I was by the battles already fought. Maya deserved to see that we stood our ground, that we did not allow injustice to win, no matter how long it took. By the time Nathan completed his investigation into the hidden trust fund, the full scale of what my parents had done was no longer just shameful, it was criminal. The numbers were staggering, far beyond anything I had previously imagined, not just because of the theft itself, but because of the careful, almost surgical precision with which it had been concealed. They hadn't just taken advantage of Brandon's support. They had deliberately robbed me of something deeply personal, a chance at a life not built on desperation and survival. They had known what they were doing. They had looked me in the eyes for years while hiding the truth. The confrontation that followed was nothing like the first. Nathan scheduled a formal meeting with them and their attorney, and I agreed to be present only on the condition that Maya did not have to attend. This time, the setting was clinical, a conference room with polished glass windows and a table too wide for any intimacy. My parents arrived late, looking older than I remembered them, and far more diminished than the last time I'd seen them face to face. They no longer carried the air of superiority they'd worn at Eli's baby shower. Now, they looked like people who had been caught holding something that didn't belong to them and didn't know how to explain it. Nathan wasted no time. He presented the documents, the timeline, the withdrawals, and the plans they had made for their future built on stolen money. Their lawyer fumbled with words, citing health expenses and financial stress, but none of it landed. The evidence was overwhelming, and their explanations sounded rehearsed, devoid of remorse. My father sat mostly in silence, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. My mother attempted to cry at one point, as if tears could unmake decades of deceit, but even she seemed to realize how empty it looked. I said very little during the meeting. There was nothing left to ask. They had made their choices, and now they were dealing with the consequences. Nathan laid out the new options: full repayment of the trust fund with added penalties for fraud, or face criminal prosecution. I could see the fear rising behind their eyes, not because they were sorry, but because the possibility of public disgrace was no longer abstract. They had spent their lives trying to project perfection, building a reputation that was now cracking under the weight of truth. The meeting ended with their lawyer requesting time to consider the terms, but Nathan made it clear there would be no extensions. The clock was already ticking. When I returned home that evening, Maya was waiting on the porch, her laptop open in her lap and a notebook filled with scribbles beside her. She looked up, and without needing to ask, she understood the weight I was carrying. I sat down beside her and told her everything. The meeting, the new betrayal, the pathetic excuses, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she closed her laptop gently and placed her hand over mine. "We don't need them to make things right," she said, her voice low but firm. "We've already built something better than they ever gave us." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal correspondence and whispered gossip among extended family. Word had spread about the trust fund, and the reaction was far more brutal than I had expected. People who had once defended my parents suddenly went silent, distancing themselves. A few even called me privately to apologize for not believing me sooner. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation that I hadn't imagined any of it, that the years of pain weren't some exaggerated misunderstanding. The truth had legs now, and it was running faster than my parents could keep up. Then something strange happened. A package arrived at our home, this time addressed to Maya. Inside was a small silver box and a handwritten letter, folded neatly beneath layers of tissue paper. The letter wasn't signed, but the handwriting was familiar, my mother's. It was long and winding, filled with half apologies and tired metaphors about time and regret. She admitted to the trust fund theft, claiming she had done it out of fear that I would waste the money, that I wasn't ready to be responsible for something so important. She never acknowledged that it was legally mine, or that she had violated my grandfather's trust. Instead, she ended the letter with something that made my stomach drop. "I'm leaving. By the time you read this, we'll be gone." I called Nathan immediately, and within hours we learned that my parents had boarded a flight 2 days earlier to Portugal, draining what remained of their assets. Their lawyer, who had apparently been kept in the dark about this escape plan, was furious. There was now no question. Charges would be filed, and international warrants would follow. But part of me felt strangely numb. They had run, not to start over, but to avoid accountability. Even now, they weren't facing the damage they had caused. They were fleeing it like cowards. Maya, for her part, handled it with more grace than I expected. She read the letter once, then burned it in the kitchen sink without saying a word. When I asked if she wanted to talk about it, she just said, "I've already said everything I needed to." And she had. She had drawn a line in the sand long before I found the strength to follow her lead. It was her courage that had brought the truth into the light, and I would never forget that. Eli, who had known nothing of their plan, was devastated. He called me the next day, his voice shaking, saying he had just learned what they'd done and couldn't believe they had abandoned everything, including Oliver. "They didn't even say goodbye," he whispered. "Not to me. Not to the baby. Nothing." I told him I was sorry, truly sorry, because as much as they had failed me, they had failed him too. The difference was that I had stopped hoping for anything different. He hadn't. Eventually, charges were filed, accounts were frozen, and international law took over. I don't know if they'll ever be caught, and maybe that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that they're gone, and we're still standing, stronger, wiser, and no longer waiting for their approval or love. Maya left for college in the fall with a scholarship, a fully funded tuition account, and a confidence I never had at her age. We hugged goodbye outside her dorm, and as she turned to go, she looked back and smiled. "We made it, Mom," she said, her eyes shining. "And we did it without them." She was right. At Thanksgiving, our house was full of people who had become family by choice. Eli and Claire brought Oliver. Brandon came with Laura and the boys. Nathan even stopped by with his wife, delivering a bottle of wine and a quiet nod of respect. The people in that room weren't perfect, but they were real, and they had stood beside us when it mattered most. I looked around at the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft music playing in the background, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like something was missing. I felt whole.